Welcome. Welcome to each and all of you to part of our Belonging by Design webinar series. And today we have Talmira Hill of the TL Hill Group, and she's going to talk about diversity, integrating diversity, equity, and inclusion, although we'll see that she's going to change up that title a little bit, especially in the design world and in the built environment and other aspects of design. Next. This webinar is being recorded, so please do mute your microphones. For the time being, you can either leave your your video on or off. That's totally up to you. But we do ask that you mute your microphones. Next, please. We would really like to thank our sponsors for this event, Milestone Engineering in Concord, and New Hampshire Housing, who has been a partner with Plan for many different things. Right now, our MTAG program, Municipal Technical Assistance Grant Program, and they are constantly going above and beyond in ways that they can support Plan New Hampshire. And I want to thank them for supporting this particular webinar, and I'd like to introduce Rob Dappas briefly, who wanted to say a couple of words about New Hampshire Housing, and I don't know what else.
That is all, and I'll be quick, Robin, but thanks a lot for having us and for putting on this program. Many of you know New Hampshire Housing, so I won't belabor this, but I just wanted to say briefly that we're an independent nonprofit established by statute with a mission to promote, finance, and support affordable housing and related services for the people of New Hampshire. We've got programs to help first-time home buyers get loans, programs that administer rental assistance and supportive housing, and also finally, we finance the creation and preservation of affordable housing around the state. While I've got the microphone, I also just want to briefly mention that we're administering an emergency rental assistance program on behalf of the state right now. So if you know of anyone who is struggling to pay their rent or utilities due to COVID-related hardship, please direct them to our website or nhcap.org. And they can find their local community action agency. We're working with them to administer that program, and they can get help that way. Or if you know a landlord who's struggling with non-payment of rent for those kinds of circumstances, they can help their residents to apply for that assistance. So that's kind of it. I guess I would say, you know, we at New Hampshire Housing are proud of the work we've done to help communities around New Hampshire become more welcoming and inclusive. We also know that we've got a lot to learn, and so just like you, we're looking forward to listening and learning today, and we appreciate Plan putting on the program and appreciate Talmira doing it. So thanks.
Thank you, Rob. Next, please. Plan New Hampshire would also like to acknowledge our special members who, the Raleigh Agency, New Hampshire Saves, and Sellaway and Hollis. They are all platinum members and really showing their support in great ways for Plan. And we'd also like the extra support of JSA Architects. We have our office space with them, so they have gone above and beyond by allowing us to share their offices in Portsmouth. And Croto Consulting, Stephanie Croto is actually here today. She's the person behind the curtain making things happen. And she and her team donate hundreds of hours of marketing expertise and services for Plan New Hampshire. So thank you to each of those as well. Next, please. We also want to let you know that credits from AIA and from AICP have been approved for this webinar, 1.25 for each. If you are an AIA member and want to have credits, get credits for this, send your name and your AIA number to me, and I'll send those in to Bonnie, and she will get the credits that you need. For the planners, it is self-reporting, and the number is 921-3787, the program number. You do have to attend the entire webinar to be eligible. Next. AIA has asked us to talk about the learning objectives for today. So your learning objectives today are to gain a deeper understanding of DEI concepts and why applying them with intentionality is essential for integrating it into the built environment. You will also become familiar with actual DEI work underway in the built environment in New Hampshire and across the US. You'll also learn ideas about how DEI concepts are or might be applied here in New Hampshire. And you'll also learn about informational resources for further exploring DEI in the built environment. Next, this is the small print from AIA and how the course is reported and all that sort of thing. Next, please. So for those of you who are not familiar with Plan New Hampshire, we are a small nonprofit, but statewide. We're a 501c3 we were founded in 1989. We have a vision of healthy and vibrant communities across the state. And our mission to support that vision is to foster excellence in planning and design and development of New Hampshire's built environment. So there's lots and lots of ways to provide healthy and vibrant communities, and our focus is the design and the built environment, community design and the built environment. And our strategy to fulfill the mission is to share information and inspiration for how community design and the built environment can contribute positively to where we live, work, and play. And one of the ways we do that is through webinars like the one that you'll be seeing right now. Next, please. I think this is when so I'd like to introduce Talmira Hill, and while she's getting set up with her slides. Talmira is a principal of the TL Hill Group. It's an independent firm she founded in May 2001. It consults at the nexus of philanthropy and community change to strengthen social impact. She began her career in international economic development and was later appointed to serve in the U.S. Department of Education as a special assistant to the undersecretary during the Clinton administration, and she served as program officer for 6 years with the Ann E. Casey Foundation. She has facilitated numerous cross-sector initiatives and has focused her efforts in Northern New England since 2016. She facilitates the New Hampshire Funders Forum, serves as lead strategy consultant on the Race and Equity in New Hampshire series. She completed a 2-year diversity, equity, and inclusion project in 2019 with Manchester Community College, and she's authored reports on the New Hampshire Immigrant Integration Initiative and Portland Empowered. She and her husband live in Bartlett, New Hampshire, where they have enjoyed being part of the Mount Washington Valley community since 2003. Talmira, we are so pleased to have you here.
Thank you so much, Robin, and good morning to you and all your colleagues in the field. It's truly a pleasure for me to be here. I've really valued getting to know you, Robin, and your team. Your commitment to fulfilling your mission is very clear, and you've done a lot to advance that mission, and I'm really pleased and glad to have the opportunity to be with you this morning.
Thank you.
It's also wonderful to see some familiar faces, and to those of you who may be in the Mount Washington Valley area, hopefully we will have a chance to connect even beyond today's webinar. So I'm going to dive right in, and hopefully you can hear me clearly. We have a fair amount of information to cover, but we also would like this to be as interactive as possible. So if you're thinking of questions or have interesting thoughts about the work, the information I'm sharing, please jot them down, and also feel free to use chat to indicate any particular questions. And you'll see as we go along that there will be some pause points during which I'll try to answer any questions that have come up in the chat. All right. So, and again, thank you to Stephanie for being our partner in this morning as well, to help with behind the scenes and also with the chat. And thank you, Robin, for doing that. So again, as Robin said earlier, the desired result for today is to really consider how the concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or in our case, belonging, create a foundation, a solid foundation for the built environment. The notion of belonging and how that differs from inclusion is one that will be covered a little bit later. But for those of you who are already familiar with the phrase diversity, equity, and inclusion, um, belonging simply adds another dimension to the notion of feeling included. And we'll go over that a little bit later. So today we'd like to define what we mean by diversity, what we mean by equity, and what we mean by belonging. We're going to consider some examples from the built environment, and then you will have an opportunity to discuss with your colleagues how these concepts are relevant for New Hampshire's built environment. Now, before we get started, we'd like to engage you in a quick poll, and we'd like to ask you how familiar you are with the concepts of diversity, equity, and belonging, or diversity, equity, and inclusion. So if you'll look at the screen, you should see a poll has popped up. Please complete the poll. And while you're completing the poll, Robin is checking to see if there are any questions. Probably not yet. We haven't really gotten started. But this is great. We're just trying to get a sense of folks' familiarity with the terms. And feel free to be as candid as possible. The polls are anonymous, so we have no way of knowing if it's Scott or or Andy replying. And great. Okay, it looks like we just have to have one more person who hasn't voted. And it might be me because, of course, I'm the person leading the webinar. So we can probably end the poll here and take a look at the results. Okay, so it looks like this is excellent. We have 9 folks who are somewhat familiar. We've got 6 folks who feel very familiar, and only a couple who aren't quite as familiar. Well, thank you for sharing that information. Hopefully by the end of this session, you'll all feel at least somewhat familiar. And those of you who are already very familiar, I hope I'll give you some additional information to add to your reservoir of knowledge. All right. Thank you, Stephanie. Okay, there we go. Now, in terms of the first term, diversity, we're going to really think about why diversity matters in the built environment. Of course, we've heard several statistics about why diversity matters in the private sector, Fortune 500 companies that are more diverse in the boardroom and in the C-suite, so to speak, actually gain higher revenue and do better, have better profits and do better than their peers. Of course, in education, we understand that when young people are learning, it's important for them to learn from people who look like them and sound like them. And so diversity in education is clear. In the health care field, we're also aware of why it's important to have diversity. But why does it matter in the built environment? We're going to start by talking about what we mean by diversity, because we may all have certain understandings, but we definitely want to establish a solid understanding of the definition. And I like to use this definition by Loden et al. And this definition was designed for a diversity initiative that was workplace centered. But what I really like about it and why it's used a lot in the DEI space is that it covers the fact that diversity is multi-layered and multi-dimensional. And so if you'll think of this as a lens and you look at the center of the lens, you'll see that really diversity is about identity. It's about our own identity as we perceive ourselves, as well as our identity as perceived by others around us. So there are at least 2 dimensions there. And in terms of layers of identity, of course, we have primary identities. You may think of these as sort of what we're born with. We're born with certain physical, mental abilities. Our gender identity may shift, but it is part of who we are. Similarly, our ethnicity and our age we're born into that. These are characteristics that are inherent to each individual that make us quite unique, but also are universal. Then you get to a secondary layer of identity, which has more to do with our experiences growing up and existing in our family setting or whatever social setting. If you grew up in foster care, if you were adopted, if you were in a nuclear family or another type of family, what was it like? Your identity, your sense of everything from language to where you grew up, if you grew up in the city, if you grew up in a rural area. So there are secondary identity characteristics. Then, of course, because this work started for workplace diversity, they refer to the next layer as organizational. But this is really about how we affiliate beyond our individual and family groupings. So this is about, for example, if you are active in your community, perhaps it's your church affiliation, perhaps it's your work affiliation, your role in a particular work setting, your networks, your divisions, and all of these impart a certain identity to us. They become a part of who we are and how people perceive us. And then, of course, there are cultural identities that have everything to do with how we interact with the world around us. And so, everything from our concepts of time, and if those of you who have traveled and maybe spent some time in South America or in Africa, somewhere in Africa, as I did for 3 years, living and working in Senegal, West Africa, the concepts of time are very different. Similarly, the concepts of personal space, if you've been in Asia or Africa, are very different. But these are important too because they inform how we interact in terms of conflict. When conflict arises, what we perceive as cooperation or competition, whether we're more focused on being or doing. And doing is often associated as a Western concept, whereas being a more Eastern concept. So diversity lens is a combination of all of these types of factors, and they deal with our many types of identity. You may have heard of the term intersectionality as well. And for those of you who are very familiar with these concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion, hopefully you are also familiar with the concept of intersectionality. Now, this concept was coined by an African American woman law professor, Kimberley Crenshaw. This particular visual and this particular citation is from an intersectionality article written by Carbato, Crenshaw, and others. But Kimberley Crenshaw actually coined it. She is a professor at the UCLA School of Law and also has an appointment at Columbia Law School. She's a Harvard Law School graduate. And Kimberley talks about intersectionality because the overlapping identities we have as we interact with various systems, especially in the United States, can often lead to forms of discrimination and oppression that that may not be overt or intentional, but are happening because we are living in a system that has been built around privilege that accrues to the majority. And in this country, the majority happens to be not people of color. And so the intersectionality issue comes about when the fact is that each of us has multiple identities and we all experience what it means to belong to many different groups at once. However, when people who have multiple identities interact with systems, whether it's the workforce, whether it's housing, and many of you who are in housing are very familiar with redlining, for example, and the historic impact of folks of color being allowed to purchase or rent in certain areas and not in others. This notion of intersectionality is that by virtue of your multiple identities, you are hitting up against these systems in ways that can often cause you to be left out. And Kimberley Crenshaw often refers to the case of DeGraff and Reed versus General Motors. And if you've heard of this already, you're familiar with it. But Emma DeGraff and Reed um, was an employee with General Motors who, along with 4 other African American women, filed a lawsuit claiming that discrimination against them within GM was compounded by virtue of their gender as well as their ethnicity as African American women. And when the case was brought to the court examined General Motors and said, well, no, General Motors is not discriminating against you on the basis of race or ethnicity because there are men of color who are rising in the company. And no, General Motors is not discriminating against you as women because there are white women who are advancing in the company. And so, by virtue of being women and African American, the law did not actually acknowledge the notion of compounded identities affecting their ability to advance, and the case was dismissed. And so Kimberley has done several talks, including TED Talks, about this. But anyhow, intersectionality is something we should all understand. The other notion that often comes up when we think about diversity is this sense that, well, I am colorblind. I think we live in a post-racial society, and the issues of color and ethnicity and race really are no longer relevant. And there's some problems inherent with that as well. And I do want to call to thank my colleague Christine Robinson, who's another consultant. She's based in Massachusetts, and she's shared this particular visual with me with regard to some of the issues around, well, I don't see color. Well, if you don't see color, then you're probably missing out on a huge part of certain people's identity. And while the notion of color blindness I think most people say they want to be colorblind because they want to see folks as human beings, regardless, quote unquote, regardless of race. But for folks who are not in the majority, when regardless of race is used, it means or it feels as though a huge part of me is being discarded or disregarded. And so by acknowledging color and race and the fact that we live in a racialized society, we're actually opening ourselves to beginning to understand what that means for people who are of color. New Hampshire's diversity is actually growing because a lot of people here say, well, this is very true and very relevant, but New Hampshire is not a very diverse state. These issues don't really apply to us. Well, interestingly, Dr. Ken Johnson at the University of New Hampshire, you may be familiar with his work as a demographer, has pulled together a lot of information about New Hampshire's changing population. And we can actually, nationally, migration is happening, across the country. And in terms of migration, by population, younger adults are more likely to migrate from one state to another, not surprisingly, often for college or work, and young families or spouses moving with their spouses. But the interesting phenomenon is that African American and Latinx young adults are often migrating into more predominantly white areas. You have white young adults who are migrating often into more diverse communities that have more people of color. So they might be migrating into cities and getting more mixed with living in communities that are more diverse. Then you have older white adults who tend to be moving into counties that are also predominantly white. So you actually have a somewhat of an age differential when it comes to people's experiences of living in neighborhoods and being exposed to others. But in New Hampshire, we had the highest number of migrants into the state in 2017 than New Hampshire had in a decade. And most of those people were in their 20s and 30s. And I'm going to quote Ken Johnson here. While the New Hampshire population is currently, or as of 2019 US Census Bureau data, 93% white, 89.8% white alone, meaning not Hispanic or Latinx. While that is the case, the state has had significant turnover from 2013 to 2017. Both in terms of three factors. Natural population growth actually inched up a bit. And if you're looking at the graph to the upper left, you'll see that the turquoise, or rather the orange and turquoise colors, are for domestic migration and immigration into the state. The dark red is the natural rate of change, which would be both birth and death. And you'll see that while natural population growth is declining, New Hampshire's growth is really happening in these domestic and migration and immigration numbers. And so, though the net change in New Hampshire's state population was modest in 2017, it was about 49,000 in terms of net change in population. That means that 324,000 residents in New Hampshire were not actually here 5 years before. Okay, and 275,000 who were here 5 years before are now gone. And so, as Ken Johnson talks about it, there's considerable turnover in terms of state population, if in a state with only 1,000,003. So let's look at some examples of how diversity in the built environment is looked at. And I'm going to have to hurry up a little because I'm behind time. I'm really glad we have colleagues from Maine, and I'm guessing that Congress Square Park and the whole Friends of Congress Square Park initiative is familiar to folks who live in Maine. I've certainly been there and enjoyed outdoor activities and arts. Congress Square Park is an urban public open space in downtown Portland. Their mission is to create a welcoming, vibrant community gathering space accessible for all folks through neighborhood engagement, programming, and the arts. They have free public events from June through October. A really great example of how to engage community and embrace Portland's growing diversity. Of course, Portland has a number of immigrant and refugee communities, many African communities, Somalian, Ghanaian, and other. And here's one opportunity to embrace and become welcoming. Another interesting project that has a little more to do with a different type of diversity, as in mobility and walkability, is an interesting project that was funded by the Barr Foundation and Sasaki Foundations, and it's called Get There, Exploring Mobility Challenges in Gateway Cities. This initiative, and what you're looking at are two images from their website. And I should mention all of these resources and references will be provided in a list of references that will forward you along with a PDF of this presentation by the end of this week, or at least I'll get it to Robin by the end of this week, and she'll make sure you get it. Anyhow, the maps, these maps actually explore environmental justice communities, which are actually communities that have discovered that by virtue of the built environment over the years, they are in less than desirable geographic spaces that often were predominated by industry. There may be pollution in the air, in the water, And certainly there's little walkability. And this initiative was designed to explore the challenges and opportunities for equitably investing in neighborhoods like Lynn and Malden that are in just outside of Greater Boston. And their question was, how do residents who live in Lynn and Malden, these environmental justice communities, get around? What are their mobility issues, needs, and choices? And they did an interactive survey of community residents to find out their priorities, and then they overlaid data from American Community Survey and other sources to create these maps. And the maps actually show the difference between walkability in these communities in Lynn and Malden as compared with the communities that are not in the pink that have much greater walkability around Boston. And I do want to highlight one of my good friends, Marianne Jackson, MD, in Mount Washington Valley, worked with colleagues and actually developed an age-friendly community plan, action plan, that is part of the National AARP Livable Community Initiative, and happened to win a New Hampshire Planners Association Award in 2019 by thinking about how Mount Washington Valley could become more livable for older adults by looking at these 5 domains of livability. And again, age is one of those key diversity factors. So how are we making our communities age friendly? And here's one example. And now a quick poll. We would like to know from you if you feel New Hampshire's built environment reflects the state's growing diversity. So please find the poll on your screen and let us know what you think. Your options are: you could strongly disagree, agree, strongly agree, or say you just don't know how well New Hampshire's built environment reflects the state's growing diversity. And you can think of examples in New Hampshire that may or may not reflect various types of diversity: age diversity, diversity in terms of arts and culture, diversity in terms of mobility and access. All right, and let's see, we've just got a couple more folks. And it's interesting. So a lot of folks are not sure about that. Okay, fair enough. All right. And let's see, 19, great, 20, wonderful, excellent. So I think we can end the poll here and say most of you are not sure the extent to which the built environment reflects growing diversity. Okay, and that's fair enough. One of the things I'm hoping to do is share some additional resources that can help us and all of us, wherever we are in New Hampshire, in our roles, think about how to promote more opportunities. We do have some who agree, so it'd be great to hear about those examples, and some who disagree and think and strongly disagree. So it'd be also in the discussion groups great to hear more about what some of the opportunities might be. All right, well, thank you. So how might New Hampshire welcome more diversity? I'm going to quickly share some examples. One way that we can enhance diversity, of course, is to think about the pipeline of planners and designers and architects who are designing the built environment. I'm sharing this slide because Lisa Bokerin hosted a webinar very recently, March 31st of this year, called The Equitable Practice, Reimagining the Power Table. She was a moderator and shared this interesting graphic, which really depicts how in the United States, among folks who are employed, at the bottom you have gender. And again, this is binary, so that's the way data have been presented. But male or female, you can see more male employed. But then at the top, you see ethnicity ranges, and the turquoise color is white, and then you have Latino and is green and gold, or African American, and kind of blue or Asian. And her point here is that there is a drop off as people get into companies like Gensler, a major architectural and design firm, globally recognized. But you have people at the Community College of San Francisco, for example, who are taking these courses in architecture. But then when it gets to certification, you can see the numbers dropping off, the people of color numbers dropping off as you get into certification. And then when it comes to hiring, again, you see companies like Gensler doing their best, but still huge drop off. So we've got to pay attention to the pipeline. We also know that there are organizations out there, like the National Organization of Minority Architects, that creates opportunities for people of color in the field of architecture to get to know one another, to create a sense of community among each other. But they also host lots of opportunities for interacting with others who might be interested. And they actually claim activism and justice as one of the key points in their mission. There are also diversity-related programs like the Integrated Path to Architectural Licensure. And while New Hampshire does not have an IPAL program in our state, if you look at the upper right corner of the screen, you'll see that New Hampshire is a blue state. And so we do accept students who have completed IPAL programs. And the closest IPAL programs to us are at Boston Architectural College, which recently graduated 73 students through IPAL, and UMass Amherst, which recently graduated 3 students. And Michael Andre Matthews is just one of those students featured in a recent article. And then there are various events that are being hosted all the time about how to pay attention to different aspects of diversity. And so there was recently a forum, and again, this was held in California, but the irony with COVID and the ability to have webinars like these is that we can often participate virtually in ways that we might not have before. And I just, wanted to highlight this program on the silent minority, LGBTQ plus voices in architecture, and what does it look like to be LGBTQIA plus friendly. And finally, there are, I'm sure you're very familiar with the array of opportunities to think about designing for the differently abled or the disabled, those who are not currently fully physically able or mentally able. And I loved this quote, contrary to what you might expect, this person who was getting a special design for his home said, I don't want a simple house. I really want a complicated house because that will determine my world. And so we've got to kind of think about how to apply that lens and think about a lot of the concepts of being diverse differently. And so diversity, it's about being intentional, expanding our network of partners, joining different programs that will help build pipelines for to get to New Hampshire, and finding connections with New Hampshire themes and interests. So we're not just doing diversity to find a person of color or a person who's LGBTQIA. We're actually looking for people who also resonate with aspects of New Hampshire's outdoor landscape or the political landscape, and looking for folks who resonate with that. I'm going to quickly move to the concept of equity, which we're defining as a just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate. And this is a definition from Policy Link. And you might have seen on the advertisement for this webinar a visual that had equality and equity with people standing on crates. And I want to share this visual instead, and I'll talk with Robin about why we may want to switch out the visual, because this visual from Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which has to do with health equity, I think depicts it really well. when we think of equality, we think we should make everyone fair. It would be fair if everyone had the same access, if everyone had the same opportunities. And so these bicycles demonstrate what it would mean if everyone had the same bicycle, if we were all going, taking our bikes out to ride somewhere in Mount Washington Valley, um, or anywhere. And you'll see that that same bike works for one person. Of course, it doesn't quite work for the tiny person or the taller person or the person who is in a wheelchair. Equity, on the other hand, means figuring out what it takes for everyone to be able to actually go on the bike ride together. So if the desired result is that we're all going on the bike ride, or if the desired result is that we all have healthy access to nutrition, or if the result is that we're all having opportunities for advancing in the workplace, we may need to adjust that bike. And so the same bike won't work for everyone. If we really want everyone to achieve the desired result of going on the bike ride, of course, you're going to need to get a smaller bike for the little person. You're going to need a taller bike for the gentleman. And you're going to need some kind of bike that is really designed for people who don't have access or full use of their limbs. And what does it mean in terms of the built environment? There are a number of equity initiatives happening right here in New Hampshire. Hopefully you're familiar with some of them. Granite State News Collaborative just launched a race and equity initiative. There's, of course, the Race and Equity in New Hampshire series that the Endowment for Health has been supporting since October of 2017. And it's got work groups that are actively advancing work in 6 sectors. The built environment is not one of them, but of course the built environment cuts across all of them: education, civic engagement, government, health, law enforcement, criminal justice, and economic development. You have initiatives like Manchester Proud, of which I've been a part, which is looking at equity in education, and think about what that means in terms of schools and the built environment. There's, of course, the New Hampshire Public Health Association's COVID-19 Equity Task Force, and the governor had an equity task force. So it might be interesting for those of you in the built environment to kind of think about what those relationships might be around existing equity initiatives. But specifically for planning, we thought that the American Planning Association folks said it very well, and I'm going to play this video for you.
I always say that planning is an interesting discipline because it is the intersection of governmental action, private interest, and our presumed effort to advance the public good. And it's the intersection of those things that create the complexity for us as planners. We have institutions in our democratic society that have emboldened and often supported these inequalities and often reproduced them. And so for us as planners, we have the responsibility of understanding that where we've come from requires us to be ever vigilant about the work that we have before us.
I think it's important for community planners to think critically about social equity for a couple of reasons. As planners, we have a responsibility to understand, anticipate, and advise stakeholders about issues that otherwise could get out of control. Let's say, for the lack of a better word, we call them blind spots.
I always say that
to understand, anticipate, and advise stakeholders about issues that otherwise could get out of control. Let's say, for the lack of a better word, we call them blind spots.
This is not simply a civil rights issue. It's not only about sort of the old notions of fair housing meaning non-discrimination. It means understanding institutional and structural racism. It means not just economic development the way we used to practice it, but understanding what kinds of development can be inclusive, can lead to better outcomes for workers and a whole range of other issues. So the structural understanding behind the planning practices is what I think the current vision of equity is all about.
As a planner, professional planner especially, the organization and the profession have already decided that these are important things. And so by coming into this field, you are effectively coming on board and agreeing to care about these things.
I think planners have a responsibility to all members of the community. It doesn't matter if they represent education or economic development or a special interest group. We have a responsibility to represent all members, and I think that we have skills that allow us to do that.
We need to be creative about how to create and recreate places in a way that focus on people who have historically been underserved.
As a planner, social equity and readiness are really important components to actually be able to do this work on the ground. And it stems from institutional support and political cover to be able to do that work, because it does require having really tough conversations out in the community.
We cannot plan from our desks. That's the message I have for emerging planners, planning students, and seasoned professionals, so they can understand what are the planning issues that need to be resolved and how can we work together to resolve it.
This is one of the most important issues facing our profession. What are the skill sets that planners need to have? How can we as APA organize them, prepare them, provide resources so that they can make a difference?
I wanted to be part of the charge which provided better tools and resources and created the expectation of our profession that this is our job. This is our central duty.
I think planners, because of the work that they do with communities and community members, and because of the work that they do in shaping communities, have a real ability to address this. And I think the time is now.
Okay, and so the American Planning Association has actually released its first ever Planning for Equity policy guide. And this policy guide has policy recommendations for planners to advocate for policies that support equity, and has incredible examples that cut across different topics and areas of planning. And again, this will be on the resource list. I also wanted to point out the Native American Creative Placemaking Report. This report is fascinating. It actually identifies several examples of projects from across the United States that are focused on Native American placemaking. And the reason I thought that is relevant for New Hampshire is because, of course, New Hampshire is on the homeland of the Abenaki people, who have been, continuing to carry on their own cultural and spiritual communities here in New Hampshire. The American Indian Council of Architects and Engineers is another potential partner in our work. How do we connect with the Abenaki tribal leaders here? The Race and Equity in New Hampshire series has two advisory group members who are part of New Hampshire's Native American community. How do we connect with them and perhaps the American Indian Council of Architects and Engineers? And they too offer various equity and diversity scholarships to get Native American students in architecture into a pipeline for this field. So next poll, let's look on your screen, and to what extent do you think New Hampshire's built environment reflects a commitment to equity? And while you're taking the poll, I'll say that we are a few minutes behind schedule, but once I make it through the equity overview, I think you will have 15 minutes in your groups instead of 20. But yeah, all right. So for equity, And I'm sorry I'm not able to see the chat. So I know I was hoping to answer a few questions during the poll, but I see when I try to hit the chat on my screen, it pauses my screen. So
One question that we had
Mhm.
is from a person going back to identity.
yes,
So we talked about identity and how we see ourselves, but does that identity include how we perceive others?
absolutely. And that's an outstanding question because yes, our identity, there are two, there are at least two dimensions to our identity. It is how we identify, how we self-identify, if you will. So we have our own constructs for our identity and how we present ourselves to the world. And of course, the other part of that is, yes, how others perceive us, as well as how we perceive others. And yes, um, all of the interactive identity exchanges, if you will, are what make up our world and what make up
Right,
the social constructs. Okay,
right. Thank you.
excellent.
And then just one other observation. Maybe our habits and how we use our built environment do not reflect or fulfill our needs. So the built environment is what it is, and we want the built environment to fulfill our needs and reflect our needs, but maybe we just use it the way it is anyway. Maybe our habits and how we use our built environment do not reflect or fulfill our needs. Just an observation from someone.
That's so well said. I'd love to quote that. If I were writing a report or doing some follow up, or if Robin, you're going to do some follow up, I
Okay.
think that would be a wonderful quote to include. And I
Yeah,
think
that's
you're absolutely right because we become accustomed to our built environments and
mhm,
we sort of accept them as they are without necessarily asking ourselves deeper levels, especially given the changing demographics.
right.
Wonderful observation, and thank you, Robin, for speaking so I could hear those questions.
Sure.
All right, so it looks as though, and this is not surprising, that this notion of equity is one that has more disagreement in terms of New Hampshire's reflecting it, and a certain number of don't know. And so this is helpful because we will we will come back to you can refer to these, and again, this is part of our learning curve. Well, with this, I just want to mention a couple of equity and justice in design opportunities because if we are going to figure out how to make our built environment have a greater sense of equity, we might look to organizations like the National Architectural Accrediting Board, which has issued a statement on racial injustice and a stated shared value that includes equity, diversion, and inclusion. And this is just the top portion of that statement. It goes on, and there are resources that they're offering. There also is a firm called Co-Locate. Um, it is a nonprofit design firm. They're based in New Orleans, Louisiana, and they they are focused on figuring out how to assist anyone across the country, maybe across the world, in figuring out how to build justice and equity into the design of spaces for racial, social, and cultural justice. So there are partners out there who might be interested if we in New Hampshire said, hey, we're interested in really thinking about this park space or thinking about this trail, um, this trail, and thinking about how to make it more equitable. Wouldn't it be interesting to partner? Now, again, with equity, we want to expand our network of partners, join different types of initiatives that might advance equity in planning, architecture, and design, and then find connections that really affirm and help grow themes from New Hampshire. Now, what do we mean by belonging? And I do want to get to this one video clip before we move into small groups. So, if we think back to the concept of diversity and identity, I'd like to quote Brene Myers, a fellow Baltimorean. I'm from Baltimore originally, and Brene has a firm that focuses on diversity. And she says diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. While belonging takes the concept of inclusion another step. We all have a need to belong. It's a human emotional need that we have to affiliate with and be accepted by members of a group. And that sense of belonging goes beyond just being acquainted with folks. It really has to do with the notion of acceptance and common positive reinforcement across and among those in that group. And so that sense of belonging gives us a sense of being part of something bigger and more important than ourselves. So if we think about the concept of belonging and we go back to the first concept of diversity and sort of being invited to the party, because perhaps people recognize it's great to have a mixed group of folks with different types of identities, and then we're being asked to dance. So hey, this is great. Belonging would mean actually helping to plan that party, right? So you're not just being invited and you're not even just being asked to dance, but some of your music is going to be in that party, and some of the food that folks are eating is going to be food that's familiar to you because you've helped figure that out, and you're able to invite your friends to that party. And so this notion of belonging goes the next step. And here's Peter Block, who's going to say a few words about belonging in community and why it's important.
Hello, my name is Bob O'Neill. I'm the Executive Director of the International City County Management Association, and it's my great pleasure to welcome today Peter Block. Thanks for being here today.
Well, it's good to be here. Thanks for the invite.
Peter's new book, Community, The Structure of Belonging, is an interesting sort of treatise for us, particularly those of us in local government. Peter, it's interesting. Why this book and why now?
I started about 14 years ago getting involved with city managers, and I kind of got attracted to the non-technical side of that business and the civic engagement side. And I always felt city managers, I used to think school superintendents had the worst job in the world until I met you guys. And then I discovered city managers are worse, which makes it interesting. And I also think the focus on community is that we have reached the limit of getting things better by better technology, a better kind of business sense. We've been through a whole period of making the public arena more like a business. And I think we've let citizens off the hook. So a lot of my work has been about a culture of accountability. And I think now even more so, we've turned citizens into consumers, turned into entitled people. And so I just felt maybe it was time to raise that question and say, is there some other way of thinking about citizens?
So given what's going on, particularly in the world of the economy and all the things, why do you think community is so important?
Because it explains a lot. That if you take all the things we normally talk about, an unsafe street, a lousy environment, education is not working the way with healthcare, everything we know is that none of those are going to get better without the social fabric existing in a neighborhood, a city, a community. The idea that more programs, more money, better leadership, more expertise is going to create a different future. It's not. And the only thing that's going to create that is a deeper sense of connectedness, social fabric, community, citizens thinking this place is mine to create.
I mean, I assume that the technical aspects of what you're talking about, sort of the discussions you have in the book about problem solving, some of those are prerequisites, but not sufficient given what we have as the issues in front of us.
I try to make a distinction between good management and good leadership.
Right.
So management creates order in the world. Nobody's going to argue against problem solving. But if you want a future distinct from the past, if you want tomorrow to be qualitatively different, problem solving can't get you there. Destination planning can't get you there. The world's too unpredictable. It's too unknowable. And so you can't argue against problem solving, but you can postpone it, which is what I try to do.
Part of I think the interesting part of your discussion in the book is the description of our increasing fragmentation in communities, and then how difficult it is to get a sense of the whole.
Yeah, exactly.
Could you talk a little bit about what you see and how you think some of the things that you're talking about would make a difference?
The core of the book is that if you want to create an alternative future, you have to have a different conversation. And the conversation we're having now doesn't have the power or capacity to create a different future. You've got the business community. Each segment in the community thinks the others need to change. So the business has been banging on government for 20 years. Government's been banging on social services and business for 20 years. Social services think the business community is corrupt because they're gentrifying my rundown neighborhood. And healthcare is becoming the dominant. That's the new house on the hill. I think the largest buildings in town soon will be healthcare. They're going to probably be over 100% of our budget will go for healthcare. Nothing else is going to happen. Right. And so the quality of their interaction is so inward and narrow focused that who will care for the commons, who will care for the whole. And I have city managers and public servants as being the perfect spot to say we can convene and bring these together. If we don't bring them together, we're going to be in an economy of scarcity and fixed pie and all the assumptions that just aren't working very well.
The silos, if you had to describe for them sort of what's the upside in changing the nature of the conversation and dealing with the possibilities rather than the defense of sort of where I am, how would you begin to break those down if you're going down through the business community or groups who already have decided this set of solutions?
I would invite them into the room, ask them to leave their interests, because everybody's frustrated. So you're taking whatever issue, whatever element of suffering we have, and saying, well, let's talk about it as a community. How do we raise a child? I've loaded so much on the schools. It's amazing they can even open their doors.
Okay. And so I'm just going to quickly wrap up. The belonging piece has a lot to do with how we envision our relationships beyond ourselves and our families and our neighbors and our communities. And New Hampshire has been taking some steps in this direction. The Radically Rural 2020 Summit in Keene, hosted by Arts Alive, was really about belonging and how we embrace our rural communities as a part of this state. And Inclusive Dubuque is another interesting report that, again, looks at the rural aspects of Iowa and figuring out how you connect up rural communities as a part of the whole. The New Hampshire Civic Health Index is another piece I'd like to lift up a little bit for you. The University of New Hampshire and my good friend Bruce Mallory was one of the co-authors of this report. He's also active with the Race and Equity in New Hampshire series, but the New Hampshire Civic Health Index is administered every 10 years, and the 2020 index found that while Granite Staters ranked top 10 in the nation for connecting with friends and family regularly, so we were like 5th at the top of that list, and 7th at the top of that list for talking about political, societal, or local issues, we actually rank toward the bottom in the nation when it comes to connecting with neighbors regularly. We were kind of 38th. When it comes to talking with neighbors about political issues, we were kind of 33rd. Doing favors for neighbors, we were 40th. And so there's this interesting way in which we can live in New Hampshire and have really close-knit relationships with family and close friends, but not necessarily connect with all of the other diverse pockets and groups of people across the state. We're all pretty independently doing our own thing. And so the last poll for the day is, tell us what your thoughts are about whether New Hampshire's built environment fosters a sense of belonging. And then you'll have about 12 minutes in groups. Okay, well, we're getting started. Robin, while the poll is happening, any questions or comments in the chat? Okay, it doesn't sound like
Yeah,
there.
sorry.
Oh,
Most people may not be aware how we can encode our values into the built environment and not see design as an area they can influence.
So it is possible that folks just haven't thought about it or haven't seen how this can happen. And that was really one of the purposes of today's webinar, to kind
That's
of
right.
create some, expose everyone to some resources that can help us see and think differently. So one approach to that, when we are not aware of what we don't see, and I think one of the planners in the American Planning Association video said, you know, we may have blind spots. And by the way, that's a book I'll add to the list. There's a book called Blind Spots, which I think is really great. It's a quick read, but it talks a lot about how we can just come to recognize that we have blind spots as individuals. But one approach is to begin to identify partners and people in those fields. So if you're interested in thinking, hey, I don't really know if people who are LGBTQIA experience trail walking differently when they come up, you know, when they come to New Hampshire, or younger people or people from the city. How do I connect with some folks in those who bring that experience, who bring that lens? And a lot of this can happen informally. So if you're working at New Hampshire Housing, for example, and I love New Hampshire Housing because I'm also on the board of Mount Washington Valley Habitat for Humanity, and we definitely are folks who apply and are partners with Habitat take advantage of your financial support. But if you're wondering how folks who are LGBTQIA are experiencing the housing sector or experiencing trails, one way is to kind of identify groups that are working on these issues and say, hey, we're interested in learning more. Another way, of course, is to go in through the planning and design and architecture field. And some of the examples like NOMA, the National Organization of Minority Architects, and others who are already in the field can then begin to share some insights about how you begin to have these conversations from a planning perspective. Okay, so most folks disagree that there is a sense of belonging being fostered here. We have a couple folks who feel that there is a sense of belonging. So it'll be interesting to see, you know, if you have a few minutes, we're just going to actually have about not long at all, but a few minutes for you to talk about this. So I do want to just share that there is work happening in the field, trying to focus more on this concept of belonging. And, you know, the national certification folks, the National Council of Architectural Registration Boards actually have a program, you know, the Architectural Experience Program. And again, they're trying to figure out them for themselves, how well are we doing in terms of fostering a sense of belonging for BIPOC individuals, people who are Black, Indigenous, or other people of color. And so they actually invested in, you know, conducting a study to see how folks are faring. And so sometimes we have to start collecting information. So again, it starts with expanding our network of partners, joining various programs and initiatives that promote belonging, and then finding connections. So small groups. Now, we're at 10:12, so we're really only going to have about 10 minutes. But even in 10 minutes, sometimes it's helpful to hear from one another. You'll be randomly assigned, and we would like to ask you this question, 3 questions. Each group actually, our plan was to have 2 groups talking about diversity, 2 equity, and 2 belonging. It's 10:13, so if we can get you into those groups in the next couple of minutes, we'll take till 10:25. And we'll do 10-minute small groups just to be able to debrief a little bit with others. And I am not able to see Stephanie or Robin, but do we have still 6 groups? Because what you'll need to do when you receive an invitation to join a small group, please note the number of your breakout room, because it's like when it pops on screen, often we accept before noticing, oh yeah, which group was I? So please do your best to notice the number of your breakout group. And Stephanie or Robin, if you could let me know how many groups we'll have. If
We have 4.
Okay, 4 groups.
We have 4 groups.
4 groups of 5.
Yeah, some of them. One has one more than that.
Okay.
But we've got 4 groups of 5.
Could we do instead 5 groups of 4 and 1 group of 5? Is that possible? 4 people?
I can
Since
break
we
it.
have shorter time. Sorry.
So 5 groups.
Mhm,
Okay.
I
So
know it's not even, but yeah, go ahead.
So this is a little, yeah, we can do this as long as everybody's still here.
Okay.
So yeah, we can do 5 groups of 4.
Okay.
Pretty much.
Okay, thank you.
So what we're going to do is ask you, we're going to give you, note your new room numbers. When you get an invitation, note your room number. And while you are, so these are the different questions. So room 1 and room 4, we'll talk about diversity. How might we improve diversity in New Hampshire's built environment? Room 2 and room 5, we'll talk about equity. How might we center equity in our in designing our built environment? And group C is room 3. How might we foster a greater sense of belonging through the built environment? And what I'm going to do when you get into your rooms, take a minute to introduce yourselves, and we're going to try to put these together in a message that'll go out to all of you, so you can see again what your questions are. Okay. So anything else, Talmira?
Thank you. No, you'll just have 10 minutes, and so we'll come back at 10:25.
And there'll be a 60-second warning. So open the rooms, go in and introduce yourselves, and start talking about your topic. If you can't remember, we're going to be sending it to you. Here they are.
Welcome back.
Welcome back, everyone. Sorry that was so short.
Yeah, my apologies. I had hoped to give more time for you to debrief, but we might do a quick lightning round, if you will. Any particular highlights that you can share just in about 2 minutes total? So if you have just a couple of seconds worth of things you'd like everyone to hear, that would be great. Anyone?
It's Andy. Can I go first?
Please.
Hi, guys. I'm sorry, because I might have to jump off quickly. So we were group number 4, talking about how we can improve diversity in the built environment. Myself, Scott, and Natasha and Tara kind of dove into it. I think we started off talking about just the physical context or construct of New Hampshire in general. And the fact that, when you look at some of our downtowns, our communities, there is this old historic structure that exists that kind of bleeds, Catholicism and, tradition, but only within a certain type of environment or, culture. And Tara talked a lot about, should we be playing Christmas music in our city halls? I then pushed back and said, or not pushed back, but said, our retailers will want to play Christmas music. So like, how do you have the conversation around what is fair and equitable? What is your community looking for? And Tara definitely talked about how those conversations are starting to happen, at the city and community level. We talked about New Hampshire housing, Natasha specifically on the rental side, and how, looking at the multifamily that's available today, there's ADA and there's adaptability, but how do you make that more widespread? And so that, every unit then becomes accessible with wider entrances, and that they're working with both nonprofit and for-profit developers to have those conversations around the minimum requirements, but how do you go above and beyond? And Scott talked about really working on advisory committees and welcoming and looking to improve the diversity at the committee level, so that there is diverse thought and input that goes into policy, guidance, and things that we can share with our members.
Wow, very rich
Yeah.
discussion. That's outstanding. Well, thank you. We'll only take that. You've given us a lot to think about. Thank you for doing that report out. And in the interest of time, because we do want to respect your time, and yes, if anyone could put in the chat some of your comments, as that would be great while Robin wraps up, because there may be some follow-up information we can send you, and hopefully that could be helpful. I really appreciate the questions and the observations and the opportunity. Thank you, Robin.
Oh, you're absolutely welcome. Thanks to each. Thank you to you, Talmira. I remember the first time that I was telling Stephanie, I remember when I started learning a lot of these concepts, and I was just totally blown away. Like, I never thought of that. I never thought about that before. Well, how can this happen? And so I heard Talmira about 1.5 years ago, and talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I knew that I wanted to bring her to all of you and to our world at Plan New Hampshire. So thank you for being here. And I do hope that this triggered some thoughts for all of you, that you had some aha moments, and that this will get you thinking about how you approach your work going forward, and what questions you may have that you never had before. And so I'm really, thank you, Talmira, for all of this. And thanks to each and every one of you for attending. And again, if you have an AIA number, please just send to me an email with your, I know somebody sent it in the chat and I caught that, but send me an email with your name and your AIA number, then I can be sure that it gets reported. Thank you again to New Hampshire Housing and to Milestone for supporting this amazing webinar. And I hope you all learned something from it. Did we have a final poll that you wanted to do? Okay. So thanks to each and every one of you. Thank you for being here. If you have any thoughts about how we can take this conversation forward, if you're interested in taking this conversation forward and continuing it, let me know, because, we could do something over lunch to talk about what if or how could we. I'm happy to entertain any of those ideas. So thank you. Have a great rest of your day.